Hello and welcome back to our series on Bach's Orgelbüchlein. And today we've got a hymn tune that you really know. Almost whatever tradition you're from, wherever it is that you live, you will have heard this hymn tune. I'll play it for you. There may have been a couple of unexpected notes there. There's a C sharp, where we normally sing a C natural, and if you're from an English-speaking background, then you'll be more used to singing an F as the penultimate note, rather than the two Gs. But essentially, it's a familiar hymn, and it is the German hymn Komm, Gott, Schöpfer, heiliger Geist. It's a 1,000-year-old plain chant melody, and we often play it in rather a respectful, slow, dreamy manner. Bach, though, was a theologian, and he was thinking completely differently. He was thinking Pentecost. What things do we associate with Pentecost? I think, at the risk of being a bit Trinitarian, there are three things that we associate specially with the season. The one is rushing winds. The second one is tongues of fire. And the third one is people behaving in an entirely unexpected and unpredictable manner. And so as we look at Bach's prelude on this piece, we're struck with three things. The first, there are rushing semiquaver scales. The second is there is a figuration that darts backwards and forwards. And the third is that the pedals do very unexpected things. The pedal notes are on the third of each group of three quavers. They're on the offbeats. So the whole piece is just slightly out of kilter. And that adds to the excitement and to the Pentecost feel. So just one or two performance issues. The first one is ornaments. And for the case of ornaments, I'll refer you to the episode which we've made specifically on ornaments. That was the episode on Wenn wir in höchsten Nöten sein. But we'll deal with just a couple of individual questions here. So this is one of those cases where you're going to have to make some decisions. For example, the first trill in bar 2, the first ornament in bar 2 is a short and snappy trill on a B. Now, if we started from the upper auxiliary, as the convention says, then first of all, it's a little bit clumsy, a little bit cumbersome, and secondly, you're breaking the logical turn of the phrase. Here's the phrase without an ornament. So starting on the upper auxiliary, you would have if we start the ornament on the main note, it sounds more logical and it's easier to play. But of course, if we start on the main note, it does break that generally accepted principle that you start a trill on the upper auxiliary. As I say, we deal with that question at some length in our episode specifically on ornaments, so I won't carry on with it here. But I will just repeat what I said there, which is that whatever decision you take, somebody will say that you're quite right, and somebody else will tell you that you're completely wrong. In general, though, these ornaments, whatever they look like, are going to be short and snappy, if only because that's all you've got time for. You'll notice, incidentally, that all the trills are on semiquavers and all the mordants are on quavers, so they have a slightly different function. The mordants are intended to put emphasis on particular notes, and the trills are just putting a percussive roll onto certain notes on the way past. So they're playing very slightly different functions. Another performance issue relates to the rhythm. You'll notice on the second beat of bar 3, there is something which looks very odd. Here it is on the manuscript, and just to make it a little bit easier, I've written it out for you as well. The lower part of the right hand contains, as you would expect, 3 quavers of 12/8 time, while the upper part contains only 2 quavers. So how do we fit these together? Well, this brings us to another of those wider issues that we haven't really got time for a full discussion on here, and I'll refer you to the episode we will be making on In Dulce Jubilo, where these problems are even more widespread. But clearly, we're going to have to make some kind of accommodation here. Either we need to play the two quavers as dotted quavers, like this, or as a crotchet followed by a quaver, like this. So, which do we do? It's often a great help with this kind of issue to look at the composer's manuscript, because the composer will automatically write out notes vertically aligned where they're supposed to be played together, and not aligned where they're not supposed to be placed together. And so, by looking at the manuscript, even if the rhythms look peculiar, we can look at where he's placed them on the page. So I'll show you the manuscript here. And in this case, when we look at it, we would at first sight naturally conclude that the two quavers should be dotted quavers, so that the B occurs together with the semiquaver E, creating a sort of 2 against 3 pattern. But I think that would be wrong for several reasons. Firstly, it sounds wrong. It's rhythmically out of style with everything else, and it also introduces a dissonance on a semiquaver offbeat, where a dissonance shouldn't really occur. Secondly, look more closely at the whole thing. The melody throughout the whole piece is written out as 4 crotchets and a bar, so actually every beat contains a disparity. It's just that we only notice it here, which is the only place that a passing note's been added, and the beat divided into 2. Now, we don't know precisely how Bach worked, whether, having decided on his figuration, he then wrote out the whole of the chorale melody and then added the figuration around it, or whether he simply worked from bar 1 onwards, although the layout of the collection as a whole would tend to suggest the latter. Some of the works, incidentally, he'd composed earlier and copied into the book, while others were composed straight into the book. In any event, in this case, he writes the chorale melody out in its normal common time format, and he simply doesn't find it necessary to dot all the crotchets. So the disparity isn't actually so odd. And for 18th century composers, it wasn't as important as it is for us that the sums necessarily added up. Some things were just obvious. Well, it seems to work best played as crotchet and quaver, so that the B lands on the 3rd quaver beat. It's rather interesting to look at how different editions represent this on the page. I'll compare 3 of them. I think worst of the 3 is the old Bach Gesellschaft edition, which comes off pretty badly because although they align the notes where you would hope to play them, they choose to dot the quaver, which isn't what Bach wrote, and is therefore a poor piece of editing. Its replacement, the neue Bach-Ausgabe, that is Bärenreiter's edition, the new Bach edition, is better in that it reproduces faithfully what Bach wrote in the manuscript. And that is okay as a scholarly edition, although it's a bit unfortunate for a performer because it gives the impression that it should be played like that, which I think probably it shouldn't. The best of the 3, in my opinion, is the late Walter Emery's edition for Novello, where he retains the quavers, as Bach wrote, but he aligns the B with the chord. Now, you could argue from a scholarly perspective that that isn't quite what Bach has written, and therefore he should have noted it, but this is really a performing edition. I think really it's rather interesting to look at how the different editions deal with that problem, if only because it shows how you should look questioningly at the edition that you're playing from. The only other thing I'd like to say about the piece is those offbeat pedal notes. I've often said that you should picture how individual notes would be played on an instrument other than on the organ. So in this case, perhaps on a cello in an ensemble of some sort. Would the cellist be looking anxiously at putting those quavers as exact quavers? I think not. They are intended as a kind of offbeat noise, just to reinforce the piece being a little bit out of kilter. And the exact duration of those quavers is less important than their attack. And so I wouldn't get too hung up in timing your quavers precisely. So enjoy the piece and enjoy the feeling that you actually know the chorale, you know the hymn tune on this occasion.